Firstly, I thank Hannah and Gregory for setting up this workshop. If you have not seen my presentation yesterday, do not fret. We will cover the same material and much more. This workshop will follow the form of a narrative, a few thought experiments woven into it, and a few sophisticated theories amongst the factual data. Hannah has generously provided a spectacular video reel of ancient Egyptian monuments and temples. Although we will certainly reevaluate Egypt in the Edfu building texts and ignite the research on Atlantis, the narrative and thought process are the most important. I will read you several works of research, history, mythology, and theories. I was hoping you could learn how to think like an Atlantis researcher whilst examining these amazing temples, ancient civilizations, and clues about the lives and beliefs of the people who once owned them. The aim is to make this workshop fun, absorbing and interactive, introducing everyone to the fascinating and enigmatic world of the ancient Egyptians, their Atlantean origins, and a route back to the ancient origins of all civilizations. This could indicate that these cities were already there before the comet hit between 10,800 BC and 9,600 BC. Interestingly, the Egyptian Sphinx and other old temples on the Giza Plateau also show massive water erosion around the bottom part of the structures. The pyramids have been refurbished or added to many times, so maybe their water damage was built over by the pharaohs of Egypt. In Plato's Timaeus, the Egyptian priests, who are telling the story of Atlantis to Solon, Plato's great-grandfather, refer to the end of Atlantis being 9,000 BC, and the text was based on information from 600 BC, making it 9,600 BC, which fits exactly with the second flood. The impact of the comet S triggered massive tsunamis and tidal waves that, according to Tibetan history, even reached the Himalayas, which are 3 miles above sea level, finally destroying this land mass and forcing some continents like Atlantis to disappear and others to rise up and create new land masses. This was a time of massive upheaval and change, and the fact that anyone survived is a miracle. Or is it? In every indigenous culture around the world, they talk of helper groups of people who came to them after the Great Flood and taught them survival skills, new agriculture practices, and gave them their laws of civilization to help these survivors start again. These people are referred to as the Shining Ones, followers of Horus, the 7 sages, the Manu, the Urukihu, etc. around the world, and are even thought to have led to becoming the Tuatha De Danann, who made their way along the Danube River up into Scandinavia, the west part of England and Scotland, and round into Ireland, until eventually they were sent to live underground by the invading armies. They are said to have been the Druids, working with the laws of nature and understanding how electricity and magnetism work, so they could harness and control the world of physical matter or light. Every culture describes these people in the same way: very tall, often with elongated heads, red or blonde hair, green or blue eyes, and very wise. They knew how to bend the laws of physics and could do things that looked like magic to the local inhabitants. Consequently, they called them mages or magicians. For example, dematerialization of stones, creating all the polygonal stone walls found all over the world, levitation of rocks, to build all the pyramids around the world said to be power generators and data storage centers, flying on rocks, many of which can still be seen in Japan and other countries today, and could also flip between invisible and visible themselves, hence they are interdimensional beings, showing that they knew how to harness and manipulate energy, consciousness. These super beings, the gods or Elohim, meaning powerful ones, reseeded the waning populations, possibly either through mating with the local people or genetically modifying them, meaning that we have their DNA in us and can be seen as a hybrid species. The ancient Egyptian texts say that the first fully human pharaoh was Menes in 3100 BC, and before this they were half human and half divine. Many of the indigenous tribes around the world say that they are still in touch with these progenitors of the human race and connect with them by using plant medicine and or connecting with them where the veils are said to be thinner and connect us into other dimensions. In particular, the Dogon tribe of Africa, who said that their ancestors don't visit them anymore and stopped around 500 years ago, but they still connect and talk to them. This could be seen as channeling or connecting to spirits, which is what we call these interdimensional people now. The Dogon tribe are the ones who say their ancestors come from Sirius B, which was later confirmed by strong telescopes. These super beings, or the great men of old, are the same people who lived in Atlantis, and as such they were very advanced beings. When we think about Greek or Roman mythology, this probably gives us a flavor of how these people were regarded, but even so, I do not believe that humans were unintelligent back then. Humans may have evolved from apes originally, but this would have been millions and millions of years ago, and according to many indigenous tribes, Mayans, Hindu texts, Hopi Indians, etc. We have been wiped out many times, but humanity is always reseeded by these same gods and the few survivors from each cataclysm. The first documented mention of Atlantis is by Plato in Timaeus and Critias, and since then there have now been more than 20,000 books written on the subject, showing us that many people feel drawn to this topic, possibly because they've even had other lives there. These books vary from purely evidence-based, there's not much evidence, to purely esoteric-based, which I suspect is why we still don't have definitive answers around Atlantis yet, and possibly never will. When we look back at the amount of libraries housing ancient texts and historical accounts that have been destroyed over the years by the invading armies, 67 alone on Wikipedia, such as the Library of Carthage and the Library of Alexandria by the Romans, and later on the Arabs and all the Mayan and Aztec history destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors, as well as the rest of Europe and Indian, Chinese, and Arabic libraries, histories, we begin to realize that we only have small fragments of texts left from each and mythology, and may never get to the real truth of Atlantis. However, what we do have is increasing evidence of great cataclysms and the resulting floods that have occurred in our history from the disciplines of geology, zoology, anthropology, botany, and astronomy, and evidence of an advanced civilization that lived on this planet before us. Ice samples from Greenland and shells found along mountaintops around the world prove that there was a great worldwide flood, possibly even two during the Younger Dryas period, 10 to 800 BC to 9600 BC. In fact, there is even evidence that the poles have shifted place at least 4 times over the years, with the indigenous tribes saying the same thing, and we already know that Earth has been hit by comets, asteroids, and meteors many times by the craters that have formed around the world. So, although we don't have evidence of a lost continent somewhere called Atlantis, what we do have is evidence of lost land mass and many ancient texts or indigenous accounts who refer to this lost island. The Egyptian Edfu building texts, hieroglyphics, that are only partially translated, refer to creation beginning on the island of Trampling or the island of the egg. And after a great cataclysm where this island was destroyed, the people left there and set up civilization in other parts of the world. The hieroglyphics on the pyramid of Xochicalco in Mexico tell the same story. The ancient texts and indigenous stories from the Vedas to the Emerald tablets to the Sumerian kings list and many other kings lists from other cultures indicate that there was a first great flood around 35,000 years ago, which is when the first part of Atlantis, northern part, was destroyed and sank under the ocean. This also appears to fit with Thoth, Hermes in Greek, who wrote the Emerald tablets and was a priest-king of Atlantis, leaving the planet around 36 or 400 BC. He probably knew that a great cataclysm was coming, as they were master astronomers, and who built the pyramids on the Giza Plateau in order to store wisdom and knowledge so that it wouldn't be lost. In fact, there is new evidence from Armando May that shows that the entire Giza Plateau, including all the other temples, align exactly with the night sky in 3600 BC. As much of the evidence or historical knowledge is lost from this time period, we then move on to the next cataclysm that brought on another flood, or floods around 13,000 years ago. The first one is thought to be 10,800 BC, and the second is 9600 BC, and most probably came about from the fast melting of the Ice Age, triggered by a comet or ice comet hitting the Earth. Not only did it break up on impact, but it also brought a lot of water with it, which caused a permanent rise of the oceans by 400, sinking many lost cities that we can now see under the water. Nearly 2,400 years ago, the Athenian philosopher Plato penned one of the most controversial and tantalizing stories ever written. Once upon a time, he said, there had existed a magnificent seafaring civilization which had attempted to take over the world but had perished when its island sank into the sea, the result of an unbearable cataclysm of earthquakes and floods. This civilization had been called Atlantis, and it had heralded from the Atlantic Ocean, taking its name from the god Atlas, who presided over the depths of the sea. Its main island had sunk some 9,000 years before the time of Solon, circa 9600 BC by our modern-day system of reckoning. The puzzle of Atlantis is this. On the one hand, Plato was adamant that the island had sunk in the Atlantic Ocean, and equally adamant that the story was absolutely true. And yet, on the other hand, modern scientists have mapped the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, using echo-sounders, geosat radar, and multi-beam sonar, and found no trace whatsoever of any sunken island. The result is a deadlock on how to decipher the story. Some argue that it is a myth of uncertain meaning. Others argue that it is a moral and political fable. And others still continue to argue that it is pure history, and that Plato simply got his geographical facts wrong. The essence of my theory is that the story of Atlantis, or strictly speaking the story of the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis, was an allegory for the myth of the creation of the universe, or in other words, an encrypted account of a secret tradition which had been preserved for millennia by the mystery schools of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. In this way, Plato's story of Atlantis may be seen as a true story, for the ancient sages believed that the myth of creation was an absolutely true account of how the universe had been brought into being. My theory has the rare distinction of being able to explain every single aspect of Plato's story, in contrast to historical interpretations, which are always forced to reject the legitimacy of one or more crucial elements in the account. This does not guarantee that the creation myth theory of Atlantis is correct, but it does make it the only satisfactory theory currently available. Support for my theory comes from offering a widely accessible account of the Atlantis story. It strongly rejects the popular view that the story has a historical basis. The book takes as its starting point a fact often ignored in non-specialist treatments of Atlantis, that Plato is the original and only primary source for the story, and that we must begin by locating the story within Plato's philosophical and conceptual worldview. I applaud the lucidity of Alford's argument and the transparency with which his claims are based on either quoted or fully documented sources. I am very glad to have encountered such a lucid and wide-ranging statement of this creation myth hypothesis, and to see it applied so suggestively to the Atlantis story. Before I summarize the merits of my new approach to the Atlantis mystery, I will first address the fundamental problems of the historicist theories. I should preface the following remarks by reminding the reader that the story of Atlantis is told only in the works of Plato, specifically in the books Timaeus and Critias, which he penned during the 4th century BC. Many misconceptions have arisen from the fact that people have not bothered to read or understand Plato, preferring instead to lend credence to the opinions of later commentators such as Ignatius Donnelly, Madame Blavatsky, and Edgar Cayce, who have consistently promoted the idea that the story of Atlantis was true in a historical sense. It is my sincere belief that these modern individuals have muddied the waters of Plato's original account, no pun intended. As much as Atlantis hunters would wish Plato to have been a historian in the mold of Herodotus or Thucydides, he was not, and nor was he a geographer in the mold of, say, Hecataeus. On the contrary, Plato was a philosopher and a part-time mythologist. Moreover, he was not even an ordinary philosopher, rather he was a true philosopher, whose interests lay primarily in metaphysical, otherworldly matters. Therefore, if there is any truth behind Plato's account of Atlantis, it is unlikely to have anything to do with history or geography. Rather, it should be rooted in myth, mysticism, esotericism, and the metaphysical world. It is highly significant that Herodotus, the so-called father of history, said nothing at all about any war between Athens and Atlantis. Writing almost a century before Plato, Herodotus was widely traveled. He had visited Egypt, where the Atlantis story supposedly came from, and very knowledgeable about military history. But as far as he was concerned, the greatest wars of history had been those between Greeks and Persians. Notably, the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis 480 BC, and the Battle of Plataea 479 BC. Moreover, in regard to the Battle of Plataea, Herodotus tells a highly revealing story of a bragging contest between the Athenians and the Tegeans, in which each side listed their greatest military accomplishments. Here, the Athenians recited their heroism at the Battle of Marathon, but spoke also of their achievements in ancient times, their intervention in the War of the Seven against Thebes, their repulsion of the Amazonians who had invaded Attica, and their instrumental role in the Trojan War. But as for the idea that their ancestors had repulsed the invasion of Atlantis, the Athenian soldiers said nothing at all. A very strange omission if Plato's account contained any historical truth. Plato's story is also called into question by several other statements made by Herodotus. The greatest danger ever faced by the Athenians, he said, was when the Persian army had invaded Attica and instigated the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. The biggest armed force ever assembled, he said, was that of the Persian king Xerxes, 480 BC. The biggest island in the whole world, he said, was Sardinia, and the earliest sea empire in the Mediterranean, he said, had been forged by King Minos of Knossos. All of these claims fly in the face of Plato's claim nearly a century later that Atlantis had been the biggest island in the world and had assembled the largest army ever to forge the first sea empire of the Mediterranean. Thus spoke the historian Herodotus, who, had he lived a century later, would have been highly skeptical of the historicity of Plato's story. Socrates was one of the greatest intellectuals of his day, and yet, when Critias introduced the story of Athens' heroic victory over Atlantis, he responded by saying, "Tell me, though, what was that ancient deed our city performed? I've never heard of it." If the Athenian victory had been magnificent in a historical sense, or even in an orthodox mythical sense, as in their involvement in the Trojan War or the earlier epic battle, the Seven against Thebes, then Socrates certainly would have heard of it, cui. We must be dealing here with a myth, and moreover with a new myth, perhaps a variation on a theme, that a cataclysm could have instigated the beginning of a calendar 9,000 years before the time of Solon, c. 9600 BC, is not implausible. Nor is it implausible that such a calendar could have been preserved for 9,000 years and handed down for posterity via the Egyptian saints. Compare the Hebrew calendar, which is today nearly 6,000 years old. It is therefore possible that Solon, or perhaps Plato himself, learned the date of the Atlantis cataclysm from the Egyptian priests at the town of Sais. But the important question is this: is it really likely that the date of the cataclysm originated in this way? In fact, everything we know about ancient Egypt argues against the possibility. Archaeologists have found no evidence at all for a calendar of this ilk, nor is there any such evidence in the Egyptian texts, which generally refer to ancient events in the vaguest of terms. Moreover, even when we do find numbers in these texts, they usually turn out to be sacred, symbolic, or rounded, the latter suggesting some imaginative ex post rationalization by the priests. To presume, as some researchers do, that the saints possessed a calendar dating back 9,000 years to a time 1,000 years earlier than the foundation of their own state is to go far beyond what can be justified. There is more. Why is it that the saint tradition preserved only the date of the Atlantis cataclysm? After all, Plato had the Egyptian priest claim that several cataclysms had occurred after the sinking of Atlantis, including the famous flood of Deucalion, and yet nowhere in Egypt, nor in Plato, nor anywhere else in the Greek writings do we find any record of the dates of these subsequent cataclysms. If Solon, or Plato, really did receive the date of the Atlantis cataclysm from the Egyptian priests, why did he not also receive the dates of the other, more recent events? There is another problem, too. Why is it that only the Egyptian sites preserve the date of the Atlantis cataclysm? If the event was historical and as dramatic as Plato suggests, then it would have affected much of the world and would have been recorded in other ancient traditions. But, despite the prevalence of worldwide flood myths, no record has ever been found pointing to the date 9600 BC. In summary, it is a leap of faith to suppose that the Egyptian sites had access to the purported date when no one else in the world did. It is a further leap of faith to suppose that the Egyptian records were entirely destroyed from an archaeological perspective. It is a further leap of faith to suppose that Solon had access to these records when no one else did. And it is a leap of faith, too, to suppose that Solon's testimony fell into the hands of Plato and no one else. To go with all these suppositions is to hop, skip, and jump into the land of improbability. And there still remains the awkward problem of explaining how Plato, or the Egyptians, if one prefers, knew the date of the Atlantis cataclysm, but not the dates of the three more recent cataclysms that followed it, including the well-known flood of Deucalion. A more likely explanation for the date of the war is that Plato was speaking enigmatically, and that 9,000 years ago signified 9 eons ago, i.e. an infinitely long time ago. See the evidence compiled in my book. The implication of the historicist argument is that two highly advanced civilizations, Atlantis and Athens respectively, existed c. 9600 BC. And yet, according to archaeologists, civilization began much more recently, c. 4000 BC, in the lands of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. How then could the two fantastic civilizations described by Plato have existed more than 5,000 years earlier, during what archaeologists call the Neolithic period? The idea is controversial, to say the least. As regards Atlantis, Plato placed the former island in the Atlantic Ocean. On this point, his language is unequivocal. Atlantis had been in the great ocean, in the Atlantis Ocean, in the realm of Atlas, opposite the pillars of Heracles, the Straits of Gibraltar, and, fully consistent with this, the Atlanteans had directed their hostilities against Europe and Asia. To look for Atlantis anywhere else but the Atlantic Ocean is to totally ignore what Plato actually wrote. Unfortunately for Atlantis hunters, this leads to a fundamental problem, namely that scientists have nowadays mapped the floor of the Atlantic Ocean in outline using echo sounders, geosat radar, and multi-beam sonar, without discovering any trace of the sunken island or continent as described by Plato. The historicist interpretation of Plato's Atlantis is thus strongly contradicted by scientific evidence. Moreover, there is equally strong evidence against the idea of a 10th millennium BC civilization in Athens in Greece. The earliest temples in Athens, for example, have been dated archaeologically to only the 8th century BC. Below their foundations there is only virgin soil. On the face of it, then, as we enter the 21st century AD, the notion of two highly advanced civilizations fighting a worldwide war, c. 9600 BC would seem to be a complete fantasy. Rather, the date of 9,000 years ago is surely idiomatic for an infinitely long time ago, as suggested earlier. The reaction of Atlantis hunters to the non-discovery of Atlantis on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean has been to suggest that the story was garbled at some point or else expressed in poetic terms, thus causing Plato to cite an incorrect geography. This assumption means that the lost island can be moved from the Atlantic to any other alternative location, preferably one that has not been mapped by sonar. The problem with this approach is that once one presumes Plato to have made one mistake with the location, it becomes tempting to take a little license with the text, and then some more license still, and thus the situation arises where Atlantis hunters produce solutions that owe little to what Plato actually said. What we should be looking for is an island of circular shape, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, fringed by mountains, with a rectangular plain and a 6-ringed circular city within. But what we get is the mountains alone, or the plain alone, and always of the wrong dimensions, with the other features conveniently ignored. At the extreme, some researchers have even staked their reputations on islands that have not yet sunk, to which one must retort that if an island isn't sunk, then it isn't Plato's Atlantis. My theory rejects the historical interpretation of Plato's story and suggests instead that the Atlantis story, or rather the story of the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis, was true in a mythical sense in that it allegorized the creation of the universe. The validity of my theory stems from the ancient axiom that the myth of creation was a true story. The 4 keys to my theory are as follows. Atlantis was a metaphor for the primeval underworld, the interior of the earth. The invasion of the known world by Atlantis allegorized the eruption of the underworld. Note, this is a key aspect of the creation myth. Ancient Athens, which represented the ideal or archetypal city, first existed in the sky in the form of a celestial body, i.e., a metaphorical city. Note, the lowering of cities from the heavens to the earth is a feature of Mesopotamian and Hindu mythology. The defeat of Atlantis by ancient Athens allegorized the fall of the sky and the war between heaven and earth. Note, this is another key aspect of the creation myth, and parallels Hesiod's tale of the cataclysmic battle between the gods and the Titans. The theory accords with the most important facts of Plato's story. By identifying Atlantis with the underworld, it allows Atlantis to be in the Atlantic Ocean, which symbolized the subterranean sea. It allows Atlantis to be sunk, and it allows Atlantis to be larger than two continents. These are fundamental points, and yet all other Atlantis theories reject the legitimacy of either one, two, or all three of these statements and suppose instead that Plato somehow, like an idiot, got things cockeyed. The theory decodes Atlantis in the context of its invasion of the world and ensuing war with ancient Athens. The worst thing a researcher can do is to study either one of these cities in isolation from the context of the war. My theory, however, makes the interrelationship between Athens and Atlantis a fundamental basis of the interpretation. The theory accounts for all of the bizarre elements in Plato's story. It explains how the six-ringed city of Atlantis came out of Cleto's primeval hill. It explains why the island was a perfect circle, code for a sphere. It explains the unknown metal orechalkos, meteoritic iron. It explains how the island was transformed into a shallow sea of mud. It explains why the Athenian army sank suddenly into the earth. And it even explains the opposite continent, which, bizarrely, was said to completely surround the true ocean. The theory is able to resolve a crucial perceived anomaly in Plato's text. By proposing that Athens descended from heaven against Atlantis, it verifies Plato's statement that the war between the two sides coincided with the foundation of Athens in the earth 9,000 years ago, and it thus exonerates Plato from the accusation that he made a careless chronological error. The supposed error, in fact, turns out to be a linchpin to understanding the story. The theory improves substantially the reading of the story. By proposing that the Athenian army descended from heaven, it explains why the warriors sank all at once beneath the earth. The Athenians, far from suffering a tragic accident sometime after the war, as the badly mistranslated text suggests, rather died a heroic death at the climactic moment of the war. This surely was Plato's intention, given that the story was told ostensibly to depict Socrates' ideal state in action. I'd love to see our city distinguish itself in the way it goes to war and in the way it pursues the war. The theory vindicates Plato's claim that the story of the war was absolutely true by proposing that the story was a retelling of the creation myth, the war between heaven and earth variant. It allows that the story be true in the mythical sense. The theory takes into account the wider aspects of Platonic philosophy. It must be emphasized, no doubt to the great disappointment of many Atlantis hunters, that Plato was no historian or geographer, and thus we are hardly likely to find an account of a lost civilization at the heart of his works. On the contrary, both Plato and Socrates were true philosophers who were obsessed with cosmogony and the theory of the soul. In their way of thinking, something important had indeed been lost, but it belonged to myth rather than to history, and to heaven rather than to earth. Here, the theory of forms is the key, for it presupposes a fall of the archetypes from heaven to earth, including, most significantly, the archetype of the ideal state, which was, after all, the subject of Plato's story. By proposing that ancient Athens and earlier Atlantis had fallen from heaven to earth into the underworld, my theory cuts to the very heart of Platonic philosophy. The theory sets Plato's story of Athens and Atlantis against the broader context of ancient Greek myths and the older Near Eastern myths from which the Greek ones were largely derived. In these myths, important parallels are found for ideas such as the birth of the universe in a cataclysm, the fall of the sky, the fall of the Golden Age, the wars of the gods of heaven and the underworld, the fall of gods, islands, and continents from heaven into the underworld or subterranean sea, the birth of all things from the earth or subterranean sea impregnated by the seed of heaven, and the idea that mythical peoples dwelt in heaven, the earth, and the underworld. Most importantly, these creation myths enshrine the principle of personification, with the poets using human-like gods or heroes to personify the falling sky and the erupting underworld. My interpretation of Plato's story thus has its roots in a well-documented 3,000-year-old literary tradition. I would remind the audience that there is no archaeological evidence for the historicity of the war between Athens and Atlantis, quite the opposite. That there is no evidence whatsoever for a sunken island continent on the Atlantic Ocean floor, that Herodotus and Socrates had never heard of the Athens-Atlantis war, that Plato did insist on the poetic, i.e., mythical, nature of Solon's story by comparing Solon to the great poets Homer and Hesiod, that Plato did place the war in a pre-Diluvian era, predating the creation of mankind, and that Plato was not a historian nor a geographer but a true philosopher, whose interests lay primarily in metaphysics, myths, and mysticism. It therefore makes sense that Atlantis signified the true myth of the creation of the universe, encapsulating ideas such as the antediluvian paradise lost, the fall of the sky, the mystery of the underworld, and the mystery of the soul or spirit that had brought everything to life. Thus, Atlantis becomes a symbol for a spiritual quest, the quest for knowledge of the origins of the universe, the quest for knowledge of the origins of life, and the quest for knowledge of what life truly is. Alas, to search for Atlantis here on earth in the form of a lost civilization is the veritable antithesis of Plato's philosophy. The great man would be grieved indeed to witness such materialistic folly. The topic of the myth of Atlantis has been the focus of varied books and inquiries ever since Plato brought the concept to the Western world in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written in the 4th century B.C. Plato claimed the story was passed down to the Greek statesman Solon by Egyptian priests. Several other Greek and Roman authors also related similar stories of a great ancient civilization that perished in a series of cataclysmic earth changes. The story of a great flood has been found in the mythology and literature of almost all peoples worldwide, which has convinced many authors that it was a real event. In their book Cataclysm, British science historian D.S. Allen, along with geologist and anthropologist J.B. Dallaire, presents an effective case for the possibility of a worldwide cataclysm occurring very near in time to Plato's dates for the fall of Atlantis around 11,500 years ago. From my extensive research and interest in metaphysics, I became aware that Plato's Atlantis story and stories of even older civilizations, such as that of Lemuria in the Pacific Ocean, are accepted parts of the Western metaphysical tradition. Groups such as the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Theosophical Society, the Association of Research and Enlightenment, the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar, have all accepted the myth of Atlantis as a real event that occurred in time and space. In the early 1970s, when I first discovered the works of Edgar Cayce and his channelings about Atlantis, I became very interested in the subject and read many books, especially those of Ignatius Donnelly, Robert Stacey Judd, and Manly P. Hall. Cayce's channelings were fascinating and detailed, and based on the accounts of his life story, he seemed to be a very credible source. The linkage of Atlantis to ancient Egypt was also particularly strong in Cayce's channelings, and for a while it seemed logical to me in my research in its early stages in the 1970s that Egypt had arisen as a result of a migration of advanced beings from the doomed Atlantic island continent. It is also somewhat interesting that Mark Lehner, so often mentioned in this book as one of the strongest proponents of the accepted paradigms of academic Egyptology and highly doubtful of the existence of any previous Commission civilization before the dynastic periods, started his career as a follower of the channelings of Edgar Cayce and wrote a book in 1974 in which he supported the story of Atlantis and an ancient Commission prehistory. In 1979, when I first heard the tape of the lecture given by Dr. J. O. Kinnaman, it was his declaration that he and Sir Flinders Petrie had found proof of Atlantis with ancient records and anti-gravitational machines in the Great Pyramid that so fueled my interest in his life and work. It was Kinnaman's declarations that were the final key for me that obviously Atlantis had been a reality. It seemed early in the 20th century, before Casey had even channeled any information linking Egypt and Atlantis, that Kinnaman and Petrie had found the physical proof. Of course, it could be argued quite the opposite, since Kinnaman did not discuss this information in public or private before the 1950s, and Petrie apparently never publicly discussed any such alleged finds, that Kinnaman only made the story up after the publication of Casey's readings in book form. This argument has been presented to me often by skeptics of Kinnaman's claims, and quite frankly, it cannot be refuted at this time, since I have stated that Kinnaman claimed he and Petrie entered into an agreement with the governments of Egypt and Great Britain never to divulge the finds in their lifetimes. It remains speculation. However, there was another claim of Kinnaman's that has recently, due to the work of Christopher Dunn, appeared to have some justification. Kinnaman stated that one of the uses of the Great Pyramid was to serve as a giant radio station to send messages all over the earth. Kinnaman claimed there was a passageway off of the secret entrance they found on the southeast corner of the Great Pyramid that led to a spiral staircase that took them down over 1,000 feet into the limestone bedrock. There, in a large room lying on a stone table, was a giant quartz crystal ground convex that was 30 feet in every direction, long, high, thick, etc. This giant crystal with thousands of prisms inserted in it was the source of the radio transmission. One of the researchers who has been very supportive of the possibility of previous high civilizations existing over 10,000 years ago has been David Hatcher Childress. A prolific writer and world traveler, Childress has authored several books about lost cities around the world. In his book, Lost Cities of North and Central America, Childress mentions finding an article in a 1960s edition of Arizona Highways magazine, which revealed that Egyptian artifacts had supposedly been found in the Grand Canyon in 1909, and the story had been written up in the Phoenix Gazette newspaper. Childress set out to investigate and found copies of the newspaper articles in a public library. Sure enough, the story was front-page news in the Phoenix Gazette for 2 days running in April of 1909. The find was supervised by a Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institute, but when Childress called the Smithsonian to attempt to verify the discovery, the head archaeologist and other officials of the Smithsonian denied knowing about any such excavation or artifacts. In fact, the Smithsonian archaeologists stated categorically that no Egyptian artifacts had ever been found in North America, and there never had been an S.A. Jordan who was associated with the Smithsonian. In the Denver Museum, I was able to locate back copies of the Smithsonian's annual reports. I did not find the year 1909, but in the 1911 report, the name S.A. Jordan was listed as a field archaeologist for the Smithsonian Institute. In a discussion I had with Dr. A.J. McDonald, president and executive director of the Kinnaman Foundation in 1994, about Childress's revelations of an Egyptian find in the Grand Canyon, Dr. McDonald related to me that one of the places Kinnaman had stated radio messages from the Great Pyramid were sent was to the Grand Canyon in America. Now again, it is possible as an informed archaeologist, Kinnaman may have known about the Grand Canyon find in 1909 and even known Professor S.A. Jordan and just connected the discovery to the Great Pyramid, but it remains an interesting story nonetheless. We also now have Christopher Dunn stating that by virtue of the Great Pyramid acting as a coupled oscillator, tremendous amounts of microwave and radio wave energy were produced. So, indeed, the Great Pyramid could have functioned as a giant radio station, just as Kinnaman said it did. Hakim has stated on many occasions that the indigenous tradition has taught that one of the many functions of the Great Pyramid was as a giant communication device, again linking our three sources together in a new paradigm of the Great Bernetter. Now I can also weave other disparate pieces of information together into a coherent tapestry. In 1992, I engaged in a series of protracted discussions with Hakim on the subject of Atlantis. At that time, he presented a very dim personal view of the myth of Atlantis, a pose which, quite frankly, greatly surprised me. He stated there was no real proof of the myth, and Plato may have fabricated the story of Solon receiving the information from Egyptian priests. When I brought up Edgar Cayce and the Western mystery school traditions of Atlantis, Hakim stated that they all were just following Plato's lead. The motivation Hakim expressed for taking this stance was the way the Atlantis myth was used to indicate that non-African people created the monuments, namely the pyramids, sphinx, etc. Hakim objected to the possibly racist way the myth of Atlantis had been utilized, namely an enlightened group of white people escaping a dying continent, and civilization came to Africa and taught ignorant, backward indigenous peoples the trappings of civilization. I should mention that it was clear that Hakim was expressing his opinion of the way the myth had been utilized to promote a racist sense that Africans were not capable of creating high civilization without a Caucasian boost. I have mentioned that Hakim is a vigorous Afrocentrist, and his opinion of the Atlantis myth reflected that stance. Hakim adamantly adhered to his belief in the indigenous Commission tradition that Kemet was an advanced civilization and the cradle of humanity, and did not need Atlanteans nor anyone else to teach them how to build pyramids and other stone structures. As one who had been deeply immersed in the Rosicrucian and Western mystery school tradition for many years, I was disturbed by Hakim's stance. I pondered over our conversations for many years without broaching the subject again with him. However, after Hakim's public emergence as an indigenous commission wisdom keeper and master, I brought the subject up again in 1997. At that point, I posited a variation on the theme. As we had already engaged in lengthy discussions of ancient Kemet and the Boo-Wizard sites, I proposed to him that the myth of Atlantis was a mythologue, that is, a general story passed down that referred to the global maritime culture that existed before the flood, before the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago, a civilization that was centered in northern Africa in ancient Kemet. I further proposed that if there indeed was a continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, it was connected to Kemet, both by trade and tribal bloodlines, and not in any way a separate, more advanced civilization. Hakim was pleased with the postulation and had no problem with an Atlantis theory if ancient Kemet was a major part of the equation. This theory sits very well with me, too, as I now believe the Atlantis story relayed by Plato, who was an initiate of Kemetian mystery schools and the indigenous tradition, was indeed referring to Kemet by utilizing the theme of Egyptian priests relating the story to Solon, and there were other reasons for his version. One of those reasons may have been that Plato, as an initiate of the Kemetian tradition himself, was bound by oath not to divulge the whole story and to protect those still keeping the tradition alive in the dynastic Kemet of his day. I now also believe Dr. J. O. Kinnaman may have been using the general Atlantis myth in the same way. Perhaps having found evidence of the ancient Cometian civilization, he then equated that evidence with the known myth of Atlantis, also connecting it all with the Masonic tradition he was a part of. In other writings, Kinnaman had indicated he knew that ancient Kemet was much older than Orthodox Egyptologists believed. In presenting this story to a group of Masons, Kinnaman may have used the myth of Atlantis as a catchphrase, as Plato had done, because he knew the time was not ripe for the indigenous Kemetian tradition to be revealed, even to Masons. Now, Christopher Dunn has brought more information into this tapestry of Atlantis. Dunn discusses in his book the reliefs that are found in the underground crypts at the Temple of Hathor in Dendara of Upper South Egypt, reliefs that indicate the Kemetians were perhaps aware of the principles of electricity. The Temple of Hathor at Dendara, where these reliefs appear, is a relatively late dynastic temple, dating from the Ptolemaic period, circa 100 BC. In one particular panel of the reliefs in the lower crypts, a baboon is shown holding two knives up in front of the apparent giant light bulbs, Crookes tube, perhaps deflecting the flow of electrons. Many authors have attempted to interpret these reliefs, such as Joseph Jochmans and Moira Timms, but none has had complete access to the indigenous tradition. Hakim states that what is shown on these reliefs was not knowledge of electricity known to the dynastic Kemetian priests who had them carved, but a previous understanding of energy known to the ancient Kemetians long before the dynastic periods. He further stated that the baboon, a companion symbol of Jehuti Thoth, the nadir of wisdom, was holding the knives as a warning. What was being shown was a knowledge of energy known to and utilized by the ancient commissions that could be and had been abused and misused. Hakim's explanation of the Dendara reliefs leads us to return to Christopher Dunn's observations inside the Great Pyramid. It has also led to a coalescence of what Dunn stated in his book and what I have proposed in the previous chapter. As mentioned, Dunn has stated he has seen evidence that chemicals were used to produce the hydrogen generated by the Giza power plant. Dunn bases his theory on several observations, the first being salt incrustations deposited around the southern shaft on the south wall of the so-called Queen's Chamber, which he believes to be the place where the chemicals were mixed and the reaction occurred, thereby leaving the salt as residue of the reaction. As one who had been deeply immersed in the Rosicrucian and Western mystery school tradition for many years, I was disturbed by Hakim's stance. I pondered over our conversations for many years without broaching the subject again with him. However, after Hakim's public emergence as an indigenous commission wisdom keeper and master, I brought the subject up again in 1997. At that point, I posited a variation on the theme. As we had already engaged in lengthy discussions of ancient Kemet and the Boo-Wizard sites, I proposed to him that the myth of Atlantis was a mythologue, that is, a general story passed down that referred to the global maritime culture that existed before the flood, before the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago, a civilization that was centered in northern Africa in ancient Kemet. I further proposed that if there indeed was a continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, it was connected to Kemet, both by trade and tribal bloodlines, and not in any way a separate, more advanced civilization. Hakim was pleased with the postulation and had no problem with an Atlantis theory if ancient Kemet was a major part of the equation. This theory sits very well with me too, as I now believe the Atlantis story relayed by Plato, who was an initiate of Kemetian mystery schools and the indigenous tradition, was indeed referring to Kemet by utilizing the theme of Egyptian priests relating the story to Solon, and there were other reasons for his version. One of those reasons may have been that Plato, as an initiate of the Kemetian tradition himself, was bound by oath not to divulge the whole story and to protect those still keeping the tradition alive in the dynastic Kemet of his day. I now also believe Dr. J.O. Kinnaman may have been using the general Atlantis myth in the same way. Perhaps having found evidence of the ancient Kemetian civilization, he then equated that evidence with the known myth of Atlantis, also connecting it all with the Masonic tradition he was a part of. In other writings, Kinnaman had indicated he knew that ancient Kemet was much older than Orthodox Egyptologists believed. In presenting this story to a group of Masons, Kinnaman may have used the myth of Atlantis as a catchphrase, as Plato had done, because he knew the time was not ripe for the indigenous Kemetian tradition to be revealed, even to Masons. Now, Christopher Dunn has brought more information into this tapestry of Atlantis. Dunn discusses in his book the reliefs that are found in the undergrown crypts at the Temple of Hathor in Dendara of Upper South Egypt, reliefs that indicate the Kemetians were perhaps aware of the principles of electricity. The Temple of Hathor at Dendara, where these reliefs appear, is a relatively late dynastic temple, dating from the Ptolemaic period, circa 100 BC. In one particular panel of the reliefs in the lower crypts, a baboon is shown holding two knives up in front of the apparent giant light bulbs, Crookes tube, perhaps deflecting the flow of electrons. Many authors have attempted to interpret these reliefs, such as Joseph Jochmans and Moira Timms, but none has had complete access to the indigenous tradition. Hakim states that what is shown on these reliefs was not knowledge of electricity known to the dynastic Kemetian priests who had them carved, but a previous understanding of energy known to the ancient Kemetians long before the dynastic periods. He further stated that the baboon, a companion symbol of Jehuti Thoth, the nadir of wisdom, was holding the knives as a warning. What was being shown was a knowledge of energy known to and utilized by the ancient Kemetians that could be and had been abused and misused. Hakim's explanation of the Dendara reliefs leads us to return to Christopher Dunn's observations inside the Great Pyramid. It has also led to a coalescence of what Dunn stated in his book and what I have proposed in the previous chapter. As mentioned, Dunn has stated he has seen evidence that chemicals were used to produce the hydrogen generated by the Giza power plant. Dunn bases his theory on several observations, the first being salt incrustations deposited around the southern shaft on the south wall of the so-called Queen's Chamber, which he believes to be the place where the chemicals were mixed and the reaction occurred, thereby leaving the salt as residue of the reaction. He also states that the presence of the two shafts entering into the chamber were not for the conveyance of a dead king's soul, as believed by Egyptologists and even alternative theorists, but for the conveyance of the two chemical solutions proposed by Dunn as possibly being an anhydrous zinc solution and dilute hydrochloric acid. The resulting reaction would produce hydrogen gas and zinc chloride, precipitating out as a salt, thus explaining the salt incrustation on the walls of the Queen's chamber. Dunn also mentions the dark-stained walls of the northern shaft of the chamber, possibly where the acid was deployed and reacted with the limestone walls, indicating two different chemical solutions were used and why two shafts were created. Dunn then proposes an accident occurred, an explosion in the king's chamber, that virtually ended the utilization of the Great Pyramid as a power plant. In his theory, the chemical reaction took place in the Queen's chamber, and the hydrogen gas was then delivered to the king's chamber, which resonated in acoustical harmonic resonance with the hydrogen, greatly amplifying and intensifying it. But one day the reaction got out of control and a great explosion occurred, ending the process. Evidence for the explosion mentioned by Dunn is the bulging out of the granite walls of the chamber and cracks in the granite beams in the ceiling. Egyptologists have explained the cracks in the granite as the result of an ancient earthquake, but as Dunn points out, the evidence for earthquake damage is not consistent. There is no evidence of earthquake damage in the descending passage leading to the subterranean chambers, which goes into the limestone bedrock and which would be much closer to the epicenter of an earthquake and should show much more damage than that of the king's chamber, much higher up in the internal structure of the pyramid. Upon reviewing Dunn's preliminary manuscript at his request, prior to publication in 1998, I must admit his theory presented some problems. Already, having decided, from the influence and insistence of Hakim, that water, Asgat, was the source of the hydrogen and energy of the Great Pyramid, I was greatly impressed with Dunn's logic and observations and had to reconcile these apparently divergent theories. My own personal observations in the Great Pyramid in 1997 and 1998 had led me to agree with Dunn that an accident had indeed occurred in the king's chamber. The walls of the chamber do obviously bulge out and can be seen to be separating from the floor. I have taken photographs of the ceiling cracks, and no one else but Christopher Dunn has attempted to explain the discoloration of the granite stone box, erroneously referred to as a sarcophagus, in the chamber. Cut from Aswan Rose granite, the box today is a chocolate brown, not the natural color of the granite. Dunn proposes the discoloration is from the accident, a great explosion that caused a chemical reaction in the granite, greatly darkening its color. Now I can weave this tapestry together and present a hypothesis tying in the last chapter and what I have stated so far in this one. I propose, synthesizing the works of Victor Schauberger, Johann Grander, Christopher Dunn, and the indigenous teachings of Abdel Hakim, that indeed water was the original medium and source of energy of the Giza power plant. When the Per Netter was originally completed as a functioning power plant, in my opinion well over 20,000 years ago, Kinnaman had stated he and Petrie found proof the pyramid was over 36,000 years old. Water was the source of the power, catalytically converted to oxygen and hydrogen in a beautifully controlled implosion reaction. In our lengthy discussions on the subject, Christopher Dunn had proposed a dilemma for me. If water was the original source for the hydrogen gas used by the Giza power plant, then why were there two shafts in the Queen's chamber, the reaction chamber, when only one would be necessary if water was the medium used? The answer came to me after long hours of meditation and thought on the subject. Browsing through my many books with scenes of the temple reliefs, my eyes stopped on one scene which provided the answer. A familiar scene on many Perba temple walls depicts the king as the realized initiate, being anointed with water by two of the nators, Jehuti, Thoth, and Horus. I have called this scene the Two Waters and have seen it over and over again since the initial revelation. In the spirit of Schauberger's elucidation of many different types of water, it has become obvious to me the commissions also recognized different waters and were depicting two specific ones in these scenes. Jehuti, although depicted as a male netter, is a lunar, feminine principle. Wisdom is also feminine in the Tibetan tradition. Horus is a solar netter, a masculine principle, perhaps that of compassion as in the Tibetan tradition. It now became clear to me why Hakim had spent so much time showing us two different tunnel systems, one deep underground and the other closer to the surface. The reason for two shafts to deliver the water into the Queen's chamber is that two types of water were released, a cold water coming from the underground Nile through the tunnels under the Giza Plateau, lunar in nature, feminine a heated water coursing closer to the surface through basalt and granite and charged with solar power, masculine in energy coming through the round and square holes cut into the bedrock for that purpose. This, then, is the meaning of Asgat Nefer in practical usage by the ancient commissions. Using both feminine and masculine waters combined provided a Nefer state to produce tremendous amounts of hydrogen in a clean implosion reaction. This reaction went on for many thousands of years, with a seemingly endless supply of power by virtue of the great pluvials, rainy periods, to produce the water needed for the hydrogen. But something happened. Perhaps great periods of drought occurred due to radically decreased rainfall, and the Ur-Nile dried up, or was radically decreased, resulting in a depletion of the water source. Another possibility is that consciousness declined due to the waning of the senses as the age of Aten, the wiser, came to a close, and water was abandoned as the source and chemicals substituted, or a combination of both. Whatever the reason, the use of chemicals led to the staining and salt precipitation Dunn mentions, and instead of the creative implosion reaction, as per Victor Schauberger and Johann Grander, of the wondrous Asgat Nefer, a destructive explosion occurred as stated by Christopher Dunn. Therefore, the crypts of Dendara may be telling this exact story of a misuse of a great energy known to the ancient commissions and warning of a possible future occurrence. I propose this explosion, this accident in the king's chamber, may have occurred between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago and is a real event that was incorporated into the myth of Atlantis. A problem that does arise with this explanation, and which has been voiced to me in presentations I have given over the last few years, is how could the ancient Cometians, being in advanced states of awareness and consciousness, have resorted to the use of chemicals and allowed this accident to occur? Further complications with this idea are that the 12,000, 6,000 year time frame would be in the commission age of Aten, the time of full use of the senses and flowering of consciousness. I do admit that this is still a problem for me today, but the fact remains that the crypts of Dendara present a warning of the misuse of knowledge and technology, and an accident did occur in the Great Pyramid. With the drying up of their water source, the Ur-Nile, the waning of the senses as Aten moved closer to the time of Amen, and the world cataclysmic event occurring around 9500 BC, a collective fear could have forced the ancient Cometians to resort to the use of chemicals and an explosion reaction for their source of energy and power. As Edgar Cayce stated in his readings, Atlantis fell as the result of a misuse of its power and technology and a disregard for natural law. The reliefs at Dendera warn about a past misuse of energy, the fall of Atlantis. I propose the myth of Atlantis was given to the Greeks as a metaphor for real events that happened in ancient Kemet, and indeed, Kemet and Atlantis were not separate civilizations. Further explorations into the Kemet-Atlantis connection occurred in 1999. As mentioned in the beginning of this book, I have been for many years interested in the work of George Gurdjieff, a series of articles written by William Patrick Patterson for Telos magazine entitled Gurdjieff in Egypt, and a subsequent video released by Patterson with the same title rekindled my interest in Gurdjieff's work. In his second book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, Gurdjieff had stated that he once had seen a map of pre-sand Egypt in the possession of an Armenian monk. This map had stimulated Gurdjieff to go to Egypt and search for teachings about human origins in ancient wisdom schools. Patterson had also been fascinated with Gurdjieff's travels to Egypt and had done extensive investigations of his work. Patterson is convinced that Gurdjieff had seen an image of the Sphinx on the map of pre-sand Egypt and went to Egypt to investigate for himself. Of course, I contend that if the map was indeed of a pre-sand Egypt, it would have contained the pyramids, as well as the Sphinx at ancient Giza before the current desert conditions. According to Patterson, Gurdjieff had stated that his teachings had come from a complete system of esoteric Christianity that originated in ancient Egypt many thousands of years before the time of Jesus. I met Patterson at a talk he gave in Denver, Colorado in July of 1999. Both Patterson and I agreed that Gurdjieff might have come in contact with the indigenous tradition over 100 years ago, especially in his extended stay in Ethiopia. Gurdjieff adamantly maintained that the source of all modern esoteric systems had their origins in pre-dynastic Egypt, essentially supporting our paradigms of ancient Kemet. However, Patterson also mentioned other statements of Gurdjieff that stimulated further investigations on my part. Gurdjieff had stated in his writings and discussions that he had found inscriptions on the walls of the Temple of Horus in Edfu, which is in the south of Egypt, that mentioned the myth of Atlantis. In his articles, Patterson mentioned a book by British Egyptologist E. A. Raymond, The Origins of the Egyptian Temple, in which translations of the texts of Edfu were given. Raymond called these inscriptions the building texts and claimed they were the myths of the origins of ancient temple buildings. I found Raymond's translations of the Edfu texts to be incoherent and poorly done, and decided to discuss these texts with Abdel Hakim in Egypt. On our tour in October of 1999, we went to the Temple of Horus at Edfu and found the inscriptions on the walls ourselves. It became apparent to us that the texts at Edfu were copies of much older texts, the temple having been built in the Ptolemaic period ca. 200 BC, and were discussing events that had taken place in ancient Kemet many thousands of years before the temple was built. Gurdjieff had stated that the texts spoke of an advanced people, whom Raymond referred to by the standard Orthodox translation of the term Neter, as gods who had come from an island that had been destroyed by a flood and had brought their wisdom to the ancient Kemetians. However, Hakim's interpretation was vastly different. I believe the texts are referring to the time of the ancient Ur-Nil over 30,000 years ago, when the vastness of the river had turned all of northern Africa into a series of large islands. As the Kemetians became united, they moved from island to island, erecting temples and pyramids, and creating the ancient Kemetian civilization. Once again, this became a basis for the future myth of Atlantis. Hakim was definite that the texts were not referring to a more advanced non-Kemetian people coming from outside Africa and teaching the Kemetians how to build in stone. I propose that the ancient people followed the river from the south and the west and formed the union of the 42 tribes in the land of Osiris, Buwizir, and other ancient sites in the south, such as Edfu and Abydos. The texts are therefore describing the Kemetians' ascension into higher consciousness, becoming one with the Neters, opening their senses and creating high civilization. The texts discuss how the Neters arrived from different islands and began the process of erecting large-scale edifices in stone. We did not find any references to cataclysms, but even so, the ancient Kemetians may have island-hopped until the 42 tribes united and coalesced into a coherent civilization. There may have been an advanced island civilization in the Atlantic, or Antarctica as has been claimed, that perished as a result of the great cataclysm proposed around 11,500 years ago. But it may also be that there were large islands in northern Africa as a result of the ancient Ur-Nil around this same time that were populated by an advanced civilization of ancient Kemetians. The myth of Atlantis may have referred to the entire global maritime culture that existed in many parts of the world prior to 10,000 years ago, much of which was almost completely destroyed by cataclysmic events. I believe ancient Kemet should be included in that mythology. Ancient Kemetian priests may have entertained Greek travelers with stories of cataclysms destroying island civilization as an oral history of the global maritime culture that once existed, knowing full well that ancient Kemet was part of that past glory, but not revealing the complete story to the barbarian Greeks.